Week 3, which I have titled today, Toil, Time, and Eternity. We left off last week talking about Koheleth's explorations in finding meaning in pleasure, the pleasure of the party, the pleasure of ambition and achievement, the pleasure of acquisition, and the pleasure of, in some cases, being wise. And he says all of these things end up in the same place, i.e., everyone dies. And he's left unsatisfied. And so when we pick up in chapter 2, verse 18, it sounds kind of hard when he says, I hated all my toil, in which I toil under the sun. But you have to look at this in light of the fact that he had, right, back up to verse 10, whatever my eyes desired, I did not keep from them. I kept my heart from no pleasure, for my heart found pleasure in all my toil, and this was my reward for all my toil. But, of course, in the end, he considered all his hands had done, and all of the effort he had expended in doing it. And it all came to a breath, a vapor, vanity. So when he comes to verse 18 and he says, I hated all my toil, in which I toil under the sun, he gives you an explanation now of why he's lost all hope of fulfillment in this. I must leave it to the man who will come after me. And who knows whether he will be wise or a fool. Yet he will be master of all for which I toiled and used my wisdom under the sun. Now, it doesn't really matter if you think this speaker is Solomon in disguise or somebody just borrowing a disguise of Solomon. You have to think of when Solomon had reached the apex of his reign, it said he had basically brought peace by uniting from the sea to the Euphrates River and north to south, this enormous kingdom. And then you remember what happened with his son. And to be honest, it's not uncommon. I've heard it said that it can take as little as 1 to 2 generations to destroy a heritage. And Rehoboam lived up to that, remember? He decided, when people complained about the level of work that they had to put in to maintain his father's kingdom, that he was going to go with the bravado of the young men he had grown up with and say, well, you thought it was hard under my father. You haven't seen anything yet. And naturally, not only did he lose all the outlying control, but he even lost most of the territory of the heart of Israel. Who knows whether his successor will be wise or a fool? Either way, all he has is the pleasure in the moment of doing, the limited enjoyment in the journey. And he just doesn't see it as enough. It says, so I turned about and gave my heart up to despair over the toil of my labors under the sun. You think of the bitterness that comes at the end of a life that's been spent building. It doesn't matter what you've been building. It could be, say, a collector who has spent their whole life pursuing the perfect collection of, who knows what, people collect all kinds of things. What happens when they're gone? Well, oftentimes you find their children on Antiques Roadshow saying, what will this sell for? The bitterness that comes of knowing that all of your effort is going to be completely undone as soon as you're no longer in control of it. That's what I hear in what Kohelet says. And he despairs of finding meaning in any of this. Sometimes a person who has toiled with wisdom and knowledge and skill must be left to leave everything to be enjoyed by someone who did not toil for it. Even, forgetting the quality of the inheritor, they didn't work for it. They're not invested in it. Do they deserve it? They mostly get it by default, don't they? You don't have to do anything, you just have to be somebody. Naturally, that somebody is the heir. And he's like, what's the point of this? In fact, he calls it vanity and a great evil. What has a man from all the toil and striving? For all his days are full of sorrow. His work is a vexation, and even in the night, his heart does not rest. You think about, modern terminology calls it workaholism. You're checking your emails at all hours of the day, the evening, sometimes even at night. You lie awake sleeping shallowly because you can't stop thinking about either the events that happen during the day or what you look for tomorrow. So whatever enjoyment you get is stained with anxiety. And here we come across the there is nothing better. When you see this in Ecclesiastes, what you find is Kohelet saying, this is the best you can expect. And here he phrases it this way. There is nothing better for a person than that he should eat and drink and find enjoyment in his toil. He did, to an extent, right? He said so. He said, found pleasure in my toil, and that was my only reward, really. And then we have this sort of odd hint of standard proverbial wisdom. To the one who pleases God, God has given wisdom and knowledge and joy, but to the sinner he has given the business of gathering and collecting, only to give to the one who pleases God. You'll find this tension quite often in Ecclesiastes, where sometimes he will call on the traditional wisdom, where this is how life ought to be. Effort ought to be rewarded. Righteousness ought to be rewarded. And conversely, wickedness ought to be punished. And yet then the awareness that the world is such a mess that it doesn't end up like that all the time. But in the end, he always comes back to vanity, 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 right? So we have here a picture of, he's tried effort, things that he can do. And he's found it unsatisfactory. Though, I have to say, I have more sympathy for his approach of, I did all of this, and what will happen to what comes after me? I have more sympathy for that approach than, say, Hezekiah, 2 Kings 20, or its corollary in Isaiah, where his as long as there's peace in my time, I don't much care if all the descendants of David are made into eunuchs and the line dies out. You do have to kind of wonder about that. But Kohelet is not that kind of person. He is very much concerned. What's going to happen after me? And yet his concern, you can see it, his concern just keeps hitting a wall. He doesn't know. And for somebody who's spent their life pursuing wisdom and knowledge, it's galling, it's grating to know that there is so much outside of our capacity to know. But enough about toil for now. We turn to poetry. For everything, turn. There is a season and a time for every matter under heaven. Probably the best known and most frequently ripped out of context portion of Ecclesiastes. This set of poetic pairings, 14 in all, of positives and negatives. The odd thing is, though, the way he has it arranged, it's not always clear which one is the positive and which one is the negative. But that's Koheleth for you. We have a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to pluck up what's planted, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to break down and a time to build up, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to cast away stones and a time to gather stones together, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing, a time to seek and a time to lose, a time to keep and a time to cast away, a time to tear and a time to sow, a time to keep silence and a time to speak, a time to love and a time to hate, a time for war and a time for peace. What we have here encompasses basically everything under the sun, right? Birth to death, planting and harvesting, or in this case, after the harvest, those of you who have gardened know, there's always that rather distasteful point where you have to pull up all the dead plants that you've taken all of the fruit and the harvest from and compost them. And it's kind of gross because, it's got dead plants and some of them get dry, but some of them get all squelchy and bleh. But there's always a time for each of these. Because you can't plant where the dead plants have been left. A time to kill and a time to heal. You think about a shepherd culture, right? The main thing is to protect the livestock. But there always comes a time where you have to slaughter the livestock. Whether that's for, food or for wool or skin or whatever, or just because you have to end suffering. The one that kind of throws people sometimes is the time to cast away stones and a time to gather stones together. Now, if you've ever worked with a farming family, you know that fields need their rocks removed. Damages the equipment. I went out picking rock many a time in my childhood on my grandparents' farm. You gather them up in the bucket of front loader and they get dumped over by the side of the field, these little weird cairns, and then they can plant and then they can plow. They can do all kinds of things. But then there is another practice. This was chiefly in times of war, when you were on enemy territory and you took all those rocks that had been neatly scattered along the side of the field and you put them back in the field, because that hinders agriculture. A time to cast stones, right? There are times for all kinds of things. And yet, when he comes to the end of this idea that everything has its own time, its own proper time, he asks, what gain has the worker from his toil? I have seen the business that God has given to the children of man to be busy with. This should provide you with an echo from the very beginning of the book. What does man gain by all the toil at which he toils under the sun? And I applied my heart to seek and to search out by wisdom all that's done under heaven, and it is an unhappy business that God has given the children of man to be busy with. Here he says, I've seen this busy business, and time is a problem. On the one hand, if you think about it, we rely on the rhythms, the timing for things. It gives us a stable platform from which to operate. It would be very odd if suddenly the sun rose in the east-northeast and the polar caps were shifted like that. But it doesn't happen, because the way that God has set up the world, there are reliable patterns that we can work within. But then we reach, he has made everything, and it depends on the translation you have. It might say beautiful, but it also might say appropriate, fitting, suitable. He has made everything appropriate in its time. But also he has put eternity into man's heart. And here's where we reach what might be the greatest tension of the human experience. To be a creature bound by time and yet to be aware of something else. Why else is life never long enough? Why does death always come too soon? If we had no concept of anything outside of time, we wouldn't have these thoughts, but we do. And again, this harkens back to Genesis, when God made all the creatures, and then he said, let us make man in our image. There is a seed of eternity in the human heart that makes us aware of time. And timing can become an obsession. You just have to look at the stock markets, right? When is the right time to buy? When is the right time to sell? Should I hold it for now? Should I wait? And people who have what they call good timing, which is usually fairly good luck, I think, they make the money. And everybody thinks, well, if they can do it, why can't I do it? But timing, I heard somebody say not too long ago, 2024 was supposed to be my year. So far, her year entailed a bout with COVID and a flooded basement. Hence the outcry, it was supposed to be my year. It was going to get better this year. Why do we have thoughts like that unless we are aware from the inside that there is something outside time? Do you realize, has it ever dawned on you, that no other creature in God's great universe has a sense of nostalgia? You don't see any other creature trying to preserve evidence of the past and going back over it and saying, oh, wasn't that lovely? Those were the days. But we have this sense that makes us higher than the animals, but at the same time, because of sin in the world. Remember, you had 2 trees in the garden, didn't you? Knowledge of good and evil, tree of life. We picked knowledge of good and evil. And as a direct result, right, we have the second half of verse 11. After it says God has put eternity into man's heart, he has done it in such a way that man cannot find out what God has done from beginning to end. After all of the knowledge accumulated, as of this moment, the human race cannot explain very many things. We like to think, and in part it is true, that we have advanced considerably in many fields, but that does not mean we really understand things. And one of the things we really can't understand is what God is doing. You see, this tension between time and eternity, it can create, in many times, an overinflated sense of superiority. Remember the Tower of Babel? God said, scatter. Man said, no, I think we're going to gather together. We're going to build a tower right up to you. And God says, oh, no, you're not. And if everything is made beautiful, again, another verse torn out of context. You think about all that he said about the vanity of the pointlessness, the meaninglessness of all these things he's tested out. If everything is made appropriate in its own, his time. That's what's implied here. Everything has its time, but it is always God's time. You think about Paul, when he was talking in the Athenian Forum, what did he say to them? That God had set times and places for all nations so that they might reach out to him and possibly find him. The not knowing comes from us choosing sin and being brought down to the dust from which we were made. But the awareness of eternity remains, and so we reach. Some people reach in order to try to grasp deity for themselves, which is a delusion. Let's just be honest. But some grasp in order to find what they were truly meant to be. And if you think about this, when he says, I perceived whatever God does endures forever. And nothing can be added to it. Nothing can be taken away from it. God has done it so that people fear before him. Now I'm thinking forward to Revelation, right? That whoever, cursed is whoever takes away from the words of this book or adds to them. And the concept of fear of God in that one, in the whole of Revelation, is either reverence that leads to obedience or terror that leads to resentment. And God has done this that they might fear him. But your choice, of course, is generated by your attitude. Which kind of fear are you going to choose? But time and eternity, this tension, affects everything. He talks about justice. He looked under the sun that in the place of justice there was wickedness. Now there's a conversation you could start with just about anybody. Very modern conversation, very current. In the place of justice. In the courts where just judgments are to be handed out. One finds wickedness. And I said in my heart, says Koheleth, God will judge the righteous and the wicked, for there is a time for every matter and for every work. But here's where he wavers. When does the judgment come? Does it come in this life? According to his observations, not always. It's a test, he says. God is testing them that they may see that they themselves are not him. They're but beasts, they're dust. And here's where he starts to ask the really hard questions. What happens to the children of man and what happens to animals is the same. They all die. And who knows, he asks, this is verse 21, who knows whether the spirit of man goes upward and the spirit of the beast goes downward? From our perspective, we have no way to know. So where is justice? I start to suspect that Koheleth is like a proto-Sadducee, because they're the ones that didn't believe in a resurrection, remember? Because he sounds really depressed about this. It's like, I can't be sure. I don't know. So is there ever really any justice? And he doesn't resolve this, which drives a lot of people crazy. Wisdom tells us, right, the innocent accused should be acquitted, and the guilty accused should be condemned. But in the fallen world, we find a totally different paradigm at work, where more often than not, those who have money are acquitted, and those who don't aren't. And if justice has to wait until death, those under the sun don't really have any way to know for sure of their own knowledge. This is an important thing for Koheleth, remember? He accumulated wisdom and knowledge, but it's all under the sun. And no amount of expert knowledge in zoology, biology, any of these other, and no study of human wisdom, proverbial wisdom, any kind of things, is going to tell you what happens after you die. So he comes back again, another one of those "there's nothing better than" statements, that a man should rejoice in his work, for that is his lot. Who can bring him to see what will be after him? But we find, from our perspective, that there has been an answer given to what is unknowable under the sun. God came. In the person of Jesus, he came to live under the sun, to reveal what is unknowable, right? Colossians chapter 1, that magnificent statement. He is the image of the invisible God, firstborn of all creation, and by him all things were created in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities. All things were created through him and for him. What could not be known was made known. And we know how that ended. In resurrection, ascension, to stand before the throne of God and intercede for those who believe. We also know, again, referring back to Revelation, what is promised. That one day all will stand and receive judgment, according to what one thing Jesus said, for every careless word that is spoken. To that degree, justice will be done. And to be honest, Koheleth isn't that far off, because once you die, that is your last chance. Whatever course you have chosen up to that point is the course that you will follow then for eternity. Oh, excuse me. And he is right also in saying that the ability to enjoy the limited pleasures of the journey is a gift from God. That everything is made beautiful in its time, right? It's right up there with that Revelation's all things for good in being ripped out of context, because there are many things that we cannot say, oh yes, this must be good. This is beautiful. A lot of times, it's just plain ugly. And we ask, why? 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 What's the purpose? But it's the awareness of eternity. That God does use everything that crosses our paths to refine us into the image of his Son, if we submit to being refined. And so when you come across people who talk about things like, what's the point? Everybody dies. So why not just snatch at whatever enjoyment you can get? Because now is all you've got. Well, the conversation can begin, well, yes, now really is all you have to prepare for eternity. We will go on to talk more about what Koheleth saw when he was looking for justice, about relationships, but you've already seen his conclusion. That for things that only happen under the sun, frustration is unavoidable. We'll just put it that way. Because none of it of itself is enough to satisfy. And that's even more so when you start looking into things like politics, ambition, isolation, religion. I am talking, of course, about the formal part of it, the pursuit of righteousness. He goes through it all, but his conclusion never really changes. All right, Dan, you can wrap this one, the recording up. We have a few minutes left.